The broken crown reeked of cheap whiskey and bad decisions. It was a sticky, sour tang that seemed to seep into the floorboards, a permanent souvenir of every lover who had become a stranger by closing time. I could feel the thrum of the bass vibrating through the soles of my work boots, a rhythmic pounding that mirrored the dull ache behind my eyes after a 12-hour shift. Friday nights were always a battle against the tide of the thirsty and the rowdy, but tonight, the air felt thick, charged with a static that made the hair on my arms stand up. I stayed behind the scarred mahogany of the bar, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew how to be seen without being noticed. It was a survival tactic I'd honed since I was 18. Look busy, keep moving, and never give a man enough silence to fill with an invitation. My hands stayed occupied, polishing the same smudge on a... If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother always said I wouldn't even reach 200 subscribers. But I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. If you feel it too, subscribe to the channel and help me keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. Highball glass until the friction warmed my palms. I didn't need the alcohol, but I needed the barrier of the bar between me and the room, a fortress to keep out the sharp-edged trouble that always seemed to find a girl with nowhere to go. Order up for the back corner. Brannick roared over the swell of the music, and I looked up, the motion as natural as breathing. That's when I saw him. He didn't fit the grime of the pub. He sat in the velvet shadows of the farthest booth like an ancient statue, carved from something harder and more permanent than the rest of us. While the room was a blur of motion, he was a singular point of absolute, predatory stillness. His presence didn't just command the space, it seemed to consume it, drawing the heat and light toward him until the surrounding tables felt cold and dim. He was watching me. Not the way the usual drunks did, with eyes that wandered and lingered, but with a gaze that felt like a physical weight, dark, hungry, and impossibly old. My stomach did a slow, treacherous roll, an instinctual warning I'd spent a lifetime ignoring. He rose then, his movements possessing a lethal, liquid grace that made the rowdy crowd part like a retreating tide. Before I could turn away, he was there. He leaned against my bar, his scent, something like midnight and wild honey, cutting through the stench of the pub. "Come home with me tonight," he said. His voice wasn't a request. It was a low, velvet vibration that bypassed my ears and settled deep in my marrow. I felt the prickle of fear, but my pride, the only thing I truly owned, rose up to meet it. I forced a jagged, defiant smile and met those molten eyes. "I don't go home with entitled strangers who think women are conquests," I snapped, my voice loud enough to make the nearest table go silent. "Try the blonde in the corner. She looks desperate enough." I expected anger. I expected him to sneer or walk away. Instead, his eyes darkened until they were almost black, a flare of something terrifyingly like recognition burning in their depths. "Not a stranger," he whispered, a sound meant only for me. "Not anymore." He left then, fading into the fog of the street, but the weight of his gaze stayed on my skin. Brannick grabbed my arm, his face pale as he stared at the swinging door. "Maeve, whatever that was, it wasn't human. If I were you, I'd keep the deadbolt turned tonight." An hour later, I was fumbling with my apartment key in the dim hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The fog from the street had followed me in, cold and clinging. I felt him before I saw him, a sudden displacement of air, a shadow that didn't belong. I got the door open, but before I could slam it, a leather-gloved hand caught the edge. Though it didn't just stop, it felt like it hit a mountain. He filled the doorway, his silhouette eclipsing the light, a king surveying a territory he'd already conquered. "We need to talk," he said, stepping into my space and turning the lock with a final, echoing click, "about what you are to me." The broken crown reeked of spilled whiskey and the kind of desperation that only thickens as the clock crawls toward midnight. It was a sticky, sour tang that clung to my skin like a second layer of sweat, a permanent souvenir of a double shift that had left my muscles screaming. The bass from the jukebox thrummed through the worn floorboards, vibrating up through my boots and settling in my chest where a restless anxiety had already taken root. I wiped the mahogany bar for the 1,000th time, my movements mechanical, my eyes fixed on the dirty glass in my hand. I had spent a decade mastering the art of the invisible girl, the bartender who was part of the furniture, the ghost in plain sight. But tonight, the invisibility was failing. I felt his gaze before I saw him. It was a heavy, predatory weight that made the small hairs on my neck stand at attention. Across the crowded, smoke-smothered room, a man sat in the deepest alcove. He didn't belong here. He was too still, too controlled, radiating a lethal authority that made the rowdy wolves around him instinctively give his table a wide berth. His dark hair was a shadow against his pale, sharp features, and his eyes, even from 20 feet away, burned with a molten intensity that seemed to slice through the haze of the pub. "That man's been staring at you for an hour, Maeve," Brannick muttered, leaning in as he dumped a load of ice into the well. The pub owner's face was etched with a rare, naked concern. He hasn't touched his drink. Just sits there like he's waiting for the world to end so he can claim the ruins. I gripped the rag tighter, my pulse beginning to hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs. He's just another arrogant stranger, Brannick. They all look the same after 10 hours. But he wasn't just another stranger. The air in the pub suddenly shifted, the temperature dropping as the man rose from his booth. He moved with a liquid, terrifying grace, the crowd parting like a retreating tide without him even saying a word. Within seconds, he was at my bar. Up close, the scent of him hit me, midnight, cold rain, and wild honey. It was an intoxicating, ancient smell that made my wolf blood, dormant and deep, stir in a way that terrified me. He leaned over the bar, his presence eclipsing the light. "Come home with me tonight," he said. His voice wasn't a request. It was a velvet command that vibrated through my very marrow. I felt the prickle of fear, but my pride, the jagged armor I'd worn since my mother died, surged to the surface. I met his molten gaze with a sharp, defiant sneer. "I don't go home with entitled strangers who think women are conquests," I snapped, my voice cutting through the throb of the music. "Try the blonde in the corner booth. She looks desperate enough to fall for a line like that." I expected a snarl. I expected the explosive rage of an alpha slighted. Instead, he leaned closer, his eyes darkening until they were pits of obsidian. "There is no one else, Maeve," he whispered, the sound a low, jagged caress. "There has never been anyone else. Not for 200 years. A second man, stone-faced and lethal, appeared at his shoulder like a silent enforcer. Tavien, the king's shadow, didn't speak, but his hand rested on the hilt of a blade hidden beneath his coat. The escalation was silent and suffocating. Rorik turned to leave, his long coat swirling around his boots like a shroud. At the door, he paused, looking back over his shoulder. "I'll see you again, Maeve Holloway." The ice in my veins turned to absolute sleet. I had never told him my name. Brannick grabbed my arm as the door swung shut, his grip trembling. "Maeve, listen to me. I've run this place for 40 years, and I've seen monsters and kings. That man, he's both. And the way he looked at you, like he'd burn down the entire world just to see you stand in the ashes. Whatever happens when you leave this pub, you be smart. Because he isn't done." I looked at the clock. 5 minutes until my shift ended. I reached for my coat, my hands shaking so violently I could barely find the sleeves. I stepped out into the fog-shrouded alley, the silence of the night feeling like a trap. I walked a block, then two, my heart a drum in my ears. I reached my apartment door, fumbling with the key, nearly sobbing with relief when it finally turned. I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, gasping for air. Then, from the darkness of my own kitchen, a match flared. "You're late, Maeve," Rorik said, sitting at my table as he calmly locked the door from across the room with a flick of his wrist. "We have so much to discuss." The fog rolled off the river in thick, ghostly ribbons, swallowing the street lamps and turning the familiar trek to my apartment into a labyrinth of shadows. Every nerve ending I possessed was screaming. I didn't just feel followed, I felt hunted. The silence of the city was a lie, punctuated by the rhythmic scuff of my own boots and a second, heavier footfall that seemed to vanish every time I spun around. I ducked into a narrow alleyway, my breath hitching as I scrambled over crates and doubled back through a service entrance, trying to lose the predatory scent of rain and honey that was beginning to coat the back of my throat. I burst onto my street, lungs burning. My neighbor, Elsa, was standing on her porch, her expression uncharacteristically tight as she watched me sprint toward the building. "Maeve? Child, you look like you've seen a ghost. Are you okay?" She called out, her voice laced with a strange, knowing tremor. "I'm fine, Elsa. Just a long shift." I brushed her off, refusing to stop. I couldn't bring the darkness to her door. I reached my landing, my hands shaking so violently that my keys danced a frantic rhythm against the lock. I fumbled, the metal slipping through my slick palms, and I heard a sickening clink as they hit the floorboards. I dropped to my knees, frantic, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Looking for this?" The voice was a low, velvet rumble that vibrated through the floor. I froze. Rorik was standing at the top of the stairs, towering over me in the dim hallway light. He held my keys between two fingers, his expression one of terrifying, patient calm. Before I could scream, he reached past me, unlocked the door, and gestured for me to enter. It wasn't an invitation, it was a claim. Inside, the atmosphere turned lethal. Rorik didn't attack. He didn't even touch me. He simply walked to my small kitchen table and sat down, his presence turning my sanctuary into a cage. He reached out and turned the deadbolt with a slow, deliberate click. "I'm calling the police," I gasped, backing into the counter and reaching for a steak knife. "Get out of my house." "Call them," Rorik said, his dark eyes suddenly bleeding into a brilliant, molten gold. His incisors elongated, sharpening into lethal points before my eyes. "Tell them a monster is in your kitchen. See if they arrive before I decide to stop playing the gentleman." The air left my lungs. "What are you?" "I am the answer to the questions you've been too afraid to ask, Maeve," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly register. "You've spent your life feeling like your skin is too tight. You dream of the forest, of 4 legs, and the taste of the hunt. You sense the lies in every man who speaks to you. You aren't human. Your mother, Lioness Silvercrest, was a wolf from an extinct royal bloodline. She hid you here, in the dirt of the human world, to keep you from a war you weren't ready to fight. You're insane," I whispered, though a cold, hard truth was beginning to crystallize in my gut. "My mother was a librarian. I'm just a bartender." "You are my mate," he countered, the word hitting me like a physical blow. "My wolf recognized you the moment you walked into that pub. I have waited 237 years to find the soul that matches mine. We are bonded, Maeve. Whether you accept it or not, your blood is already calling to me. I want you to leave. Now!" I screamed, the knife trembling in my hand. Rorik rose, his massive frame casting a shadow that swallowed the room. He walked to the door and unlocked it, showing a terrifying display of restraint. "I'll leave. For tonight. But I will be back tomorrow. And the day after. You can't hide from what you are anymore." He paused, his hand on the frame, his eyes flashing one last time. "Ask Elsa about your mother. She's been watching you for 28 years, Maeve. She's not just a neighbor, she's a jailer." He vanished into the fog, leaving the door standing open. I collapsed to the floor, my mind fracturing under the weight of his words. I looked toward the hallway, toward Elsa's closed door, but my gaze was caught by the floorboards near the radiator. The wood was splintering, pushed upward by something beneath. I crawled over and pried the board back, finding a hidden iron box I had never seen before. Inside was a heavy, silver collar etched with the name Silvercrest and a frantic, handwritten note from my mother. "If he finds you, run to the mountains. The king isn't here to love you. He's here to use your blood to restart the war." At that moment, my apartment window shattered as a massive, black wolf lunged through the glass, its eyes not gold like Rorik's, but a bleeding, vengeful red. The morning light felt like a physical assault, a jagged blade of brightness that sliced through my pounding skull. I hadn't slept. I had spent the dark hours huddled over my laptop, the blue light reflecting off eyes that felt raw and foreign. My research into shifters and royal bloodlines had led me down rabbit holes of folklore that felt terrifyingly like reality. Everything hurt. My skin felt 3 sizes too small, every nerve ending firing with a sensitivity that bordered on agony. I could hear the rhythmic drip-drip of a leaky faucet 3 floors down, and the smell of the neighbor's burnt toast was a suffocating cloud of charcoal in my lungs. Driven by a sudden, jagged needle of betrayal, I didn't even put on shoes before I was pounding on Elsa's door. She opened it before my fist could land a 3rd strike, her face pale and etched with a weary, ancient sorrow. "You're a watcher," I spat, the word feeling like venom on my tongue. "You've been reporting on me like I'm a science experiment for 28 years. Elsa sighed, stepped back, and ushered me into an apartment filled with more filing cabinets than furniture. "Your mother came to me pregnant and terrified, Maeve. She knew the council would hunt a Silvercrest to the ends of the earth. She made me promise to watch you, to report enough to keep them satisfied, but to protect you if your wolf ever woke up." She gripped my shoulders, her voice a frantic whisper. "The council is divided, child. Half of them want you claimed by a king to stabilize the territories. The other half want you erased to ensure a royal line never rises again. You aren't just a girl anymore, you're a ticking clock." The air in the hallway shifted. That familiar scent of midnight and wild honey announced his arrival before he even rounded the corner. Rorik appeared, carrying a tray of coffee and a steak that looked practically blue. He pushed past me into my own apartment with the casual arrogance of a man who owned the foundations of the building. "Get out!" I screamed, the sound vibrating in my chest like a growl. "I don't want your food, and I don't want your lies." "You'll eat, or you'll faint," Rorik countered, his voice a calm, tectonic rumble. He set the plate down with a definitive clack. "You're in the first stages of awakening. Your metabolism is burning through your reserves. You need protein, Maeve. Your body is literally rebuilding itself." A second man, Tavian, stepped into the room, tossing a thick leather dossier onto the table. He looked at my disheveled state with a dry, infuriating smirk. "The Silvercrest lineage is quite a read, Maeve. Your mother was a legendary runner. You have her bone structure, pity about the temper, though." Rorik ignored him, his molten gold eyes locking onto mine. "Give me 30 days, Maeve. A trial bond. Let me prove that this isn't a cage, but a homecoming. If you still want to walk away after a month, I will vanish. I will let you go back to your bar and your invisibility. I don't need 30 days to know I want nothing to do with your world." I lunged toward the door, intending to throw them both out, but the world suddenly tilted on its axis. A white-hot agony erupted in my hands. I collapsed to my knees, a guttural sound tearing from my throat that didn't sound human. I watched in horror as my fingernails elongated into jagged, ivory claws, tearing through the skin of my palms. My vision fractured into 1,000 shards of gold as the room blurred. "Help me," I gasped, the terror finally breaking my pride. Rorik was there in a heartbeat, his large, warm hands grounding me as he pulled me against his chest. "Breathe with me, Maeve. Don't fight the shift, let it flow through you. You are a wolf. Let the change happen." His voice was a gentle anchor in the storm of my own mutation. As the pain subsided into a dull, vibrating thrum, the door to my apartment was kicked inward. A group of men in tactical gear, their faces obscured by black masks, flooded the room with silver-tipped crossbows leveled at my heart. By order of the council, the leader barked. "The Silvercrest anomaly is to be liquidated." Rorik stood, his shadow expanding until it covered me entirely, his claws extending with a terrifying shing. "You chose the wrong house to enter," he snarled, but as he lunged, a silver bolt hissed through the air, burying itself not in Rorik, but in the base of my neck. My world turned to ice, and the last thing I saw was Rorik's face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated slaughter. The silver toxin from the bolt burned through my veins, but the fire in my lungs was worse. It was 2 a.m. and the acrid, choking scent of smoke was the only thing that yanked me back from the precipice of unconsciousness. I scrambled backward on the floor, my vision blurring as 3 figures emerged from the haze of my burning living room. They weren't men. They were nightmares wrapped in human skin, their eyes glowing with a sickly, unnatural yellow. The old council sends their regards, Little Silvercrest, the leader hissed, drawing a jagged blade that hummed with a dark, anti-wolf frequency. Fear usually paralyzed me, but tonight, the wolf Rorik had awakened roared in my blood. I didn't think, I moved. I was a blur of newfound speed, dodging a strike that would have taken my head and driving my elbow into the throat of the nearest attacker. I felt the cartilage snap, a sickeningly satisfying sound, but I was outnumbered and fading fast. Then, the world exploded in glass and fur. Rorik and Tavian shattered through the window like vengeful gods. Rorik didn't shift fully, but he didn't need to. He went feral, a terrifying engine of slaughter that made my earlier defiance look like a child's tantrum. He tore through the assassins with a savage, guttural fury, his claws dripping with ichor. One attacker scrambled over the fire escape, fleeing into the night, but the other 2 were nothing more than red ruin on my carpet within seconds. Rorik turned to me, his chest heaving, blood splattered across his sharp cheekbones like war paint. His eyes were pure, molten gold, the king completely consumed by the beast. He looked at my charred apartment, then at me, and the growl that left his throat made the floorboards vibrate. "You're not safe here. You're coming with me." I was too shattered to fight him. He gathered me into his arms, his touch surprisingly gentle against the violence of his aura, and carried me to the idling black SUV below. The Blackmore estate was a fortress of stone and secrets, rising out of the ancient, mist-choked forest like a jagged crown. It was beautiful, but it felt like a gilded cage. Rorik escorted me to a guest room in the west wing, his knuckles white as he gripped the doorframe, his instincts clearly screaming to keep me in his own bed. Yet, he stepped back. He gave me the one thing I hadn't expected, space. Morning brought a cold, hollow clarity. I wandered the sprawling halls, feeling the weight of 100 hidden eyes. The pack members I encountered were silent, their gazes wary and heavy with curiosity. I was the Silvercrest anomaly, the human-born girl who had brought their king to his knees. I found Rorik in the library, surrounded by ancient vellum and the scent of old paper. "Until we find out who sent them, Maeve, this is the only place you survive," he said, not looking up, but I could hear the strain in his voice. The walls I'd built for 28 years finally buckled. The smoke, the blood, the claws, it all crashed over me. I began to shake, a jagged sob breaking from my throat as I collapsed into a chair. To my surprise, Rorik was there instantly. He didn't command me, he simply held me, his large frame a shield against the world. For the first time, I didn't push him away. I breathed in the midnight and honey of his skin and whispered, "Tell me about the trial bond. What does it actually mean?" He looked into my eyes, his expression softening into something devastatingly tender, but before he could speak, the library doors flew open. Tavian stood there, his face ashen. "Sire, the council didn't just send assassins. They've invoked the blood mandate. They aren't coming for her life anymore, they're coming to take her womb by force." The 2 weeks that followed the blood mandate were a fevered dream of silver moonlight and velvet shadows. Inside the fortified walls of the Blackmore estate, the air was heavy with the scent of pine and the electric charge of the mate bond. Rorik no longer commanded, he seduced. He replaced the cold deadbolts of my apartment with breakfasts in the sun-drenched conservatory and long, winding walks through forests that felt alive with ancient magic. He took me to the Hall of Echoes, showing me tapestries of kings and queens who had bled for this land. He taught me that an alpha king wasn't just a master, but a shield, and that a queen was the soul that kept the shield from cracking. I met the pack, Thomas, the towering enforcer who bowed with genuine respect, and Sarah, the healer whose eyes softened when she saw the silver fire beginning to glow in mine. The young pups of the pack chased me with yips of joy, seeing a future in me that I was still terrified to claim. The internal war was escalating. My human mind was still packed and ready to flee, but my wolf was already beginning to howl Rorik's name. I could feel his emotions now, a low hum of possessive warmth that pulsed in time with my own heartbeat. Late one night, under the amber glow of the library lamps, the armor finally slipped. Rorik was surrounded by books, his sharp features softened by exhaustion. "Imagine living for over 2 centuries, Maeve," he whispered, his voice a jagged caress. "Watching everyone around you find their light while you remain in the dark." I had given up on ever finding home. Until that night at the pub. "Everyone I love leaves, Rorik," I countered, the words catching in my throat. "My mother died and left me a ghost. How do I trust that you aren't just another storm passing through?" He stood, closing the distance between us until the heat from his body made my skin prickle. "I am not a storm, Maeve. I am the mountain. I am not going anywhere. You are mine, and I protect what's mine." The tension broke that night in the forest. Under a moon that bled silver, I shifted. It wasn't the agonizing fracture of before, but a fluid, powerful surrender. Beside me, a massive black wolf with eyes of molten gold ran in perfect synchronicity. We were a blur of fur and muscle, hunting through the pines, our instincts weaving together until we were a single entity. The wolves understood what the humans were too stubborn to admit. We were already one. When we shifted back, breathless and slick with sweat in the cool night air, the restraint snapped. Rorik's hands were in my hair, pulling me toward him with a desperation that tasted of centuries of hunger. We kissed, and the world detonated. The mate bond snapped into place like a golden thread pulling taut, a physical connection that seared through my soul. I felt his love, his absolute certainty, and for a terrifying second, I felt at home. Panic flared. The intensity of it, the feeling of being so utterly known, was too much. I tore myself away from him, my heart hammering against my ribs, and ran back toward the estate without looking back. I burst through the manor doors, but the silence inside was wrong. The air was thick with the copper tang of blood. I followed the trail to the great hall, where Tavian lay slumped against the throne, his chest shredded by claws that weren't human. He looked up, his eyes glassy. "They're inside, Maeve," he wheezed. "The council, they didn't wait for the 30 days. They've already taken the king's seal." Suddenly, the shadows in the rafters shifted, and 6 figures draped in silver silk dropped from the ceiling, their blades pointed not at me, but at the heavy mahogany door where the pack's children were sleeping. One of them turned, a cruel smile beneath his mask. "Choose, Silvercrest. Your king's heart, or the future of his line." The great hall of Blackmoor echoed with the low, menacing rumble of 100 wolves, a sound that felt like thunder trapped in stone. 3 weeks had passed since the night at the pub, and the 30-day deadline of the trial bond loomed over us like an executioner's blade. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and aggression, a cocktail that made my new, sensitive nerves scream in protest. The heavy oak doors didn't just open, they were slammed inward by a force that made the chandeliers shiver. Alpha Fenrir Ashcroft marched into the sanctuary, flanked by a contingent of wolves whose eyes were the color of stagnant swamp water. He didn't bow. He didn't acknowledge the king's peace. He simply pointed a scarred finger at me, standing beside Rorik on the dais. "A human interloper," Fenrir's voice rasped, carrying to every corner of the hall. "The laws of the blood mandate are clear, Rorik. A king who claims a weakling as a mate is a king who has lost his mind. I challenge the claim. I demand the trial of verity." The room erupted. The council of elders rose as one, their faces grim masks of ancient law. Pack tradition was absolute. A challenged mate claim had to be proven before the High Council and representatives of all major packs within 3 days. If Rorik couldn't prove I carried the wolf, if he couldn't prove the bond was legitimate, tradition allowed Fenrir to challenge him for the throne in a duel to the death. I looked at Rorik. His jaw was a ridge of granite, his eyes burning with a molten gold that spoke of a beast barely held in check. I realized then that the stakes had shifted. This wasn't just about my freedom or our budding, terrifying connection. This was about his entire kingdom. If I failed to shift, if I remained human in the eyes of the law, Rorik would lose everything he had spent centuries building. Driven by a desperate need to face the threat, I sought out Fenrir in the moonlit courtyard after the assembly. He stood by the fountain, the spray catching the light like shards of glass. "Why do you want his throne so badly?" I demanded, my voice trembling but sharp. "Is power worth destroying 2 lives?" Fenrir turned, a chilling, mirthless smile stretching his lips. "Because he's weak, little girl. He spent 200 years searching for a ghost, pining like a lovesick fool while the territories grew restless. A true king needs no one. Strength is found in isolation, not in a human girl's bed. I'm going to show the Pax what real power looks like when I rip the crown from his cold head." "Maeve." Rorik's voice shattered the exchange. He was across the courtyard in a heartbeat, his hand gripping my shoulder with a possessiveness that bordered on pain. "You do not speak to him. You do not go anywhere alone." He was furious, his chest heaving with a terror he tried to mask as dominance. "Do you have any idea what you mean to me? What he would do to you to get to me?" "No, I don't." I fired back, shoving his hand away. The confusion and the stakes finally boiled over. "You keep saying I'm your mate, but I don't know what that means. Is it just biology? Am I just a key to your throne? Or is it actually me you want?" Rorik froze. He grabbed my face, forcing me to look into the raw, naked vulnerability in his eyes. "It is you, Maeve. The brave, stubborn woman who told a king to move in a crowded pub. The woman who fights her own blood because she's too afraid to let someone in. You. Not the bond. Not the Silvercrest name. You." He pulled me into a kiss that tasted of desperation and a brewing war, but as our souls touched through the bond, a piercing, high-pitched whistle sliced through the air. Rorik shoved me behind him just as a thick, black fog began to pour over the estate walls, not smoke, but a swarm of shadomites, creatures that fed on shifter magic. "They're draining the wards," Tavian screamed from the balcony. "Rorik, the children." I looked toward the nursery wing and saw the black fog seeping under the door. Rorik lunged forward, but the air in front of him solidified into a shimmering, magical barrier. Fenrir stood on the other side, holding an ancient, pulsing stone, the king's seal, stolen from the vault. "The trial starts now, Rorik," Fenrir sneered as the children's first screams echoed through the stone walls. "Let's see if your human mate can save them before the magic eats them alive." The dawn bled across the horizon like an open wound, staining the ancient stone circle of Blackmoor in hues of violet and bruised gold. I stood at the center of the monolithic ring, my hands trembling despite the iron resolve I'd tried to forge overnight. Rorik stood beside me, a figure of terrifying, archaic majesty draped in ceremonial furs and dark leather, the heavy silver sigils of his kingship glinting in the low light. Hundreds of wolves watched from the shadows, their eyes a sea of glowing amber, waiting for the council of elders to decide our fate. "The blood must speak," the High Elder commanded, his voice like grinding stone. Sarah stepped forward, her silver needle catching the first ray of sun. When she drew my blood and dropped it into the ceremonial basin, the liquid didn't just swirl, it ignited with a faint, iridescent shimmer. A gasp rippled through the council. "Silvercrest," the elder breathed, his hands shaking. The royal line was thought extinguished in the Great Purge. "Dormant blood is just stagnant water." Fenrir roared, stepping from the ranks of witnesses, his face twisted in a sneer. "She has never shifted. She cannot run with the pack. She is a human playing at being a queen, and a king who mates with a ghost is unfit to rule." The council's murmur grew dark. "Fenrir is right," the elder decreed. "Proof of blood is not proof of the wolf. Maeve Holloway, shift now or the claim is void." Terror, cold and paralyzing, surged through me. I closed my eyes, reaching for the wildness Rorik had shown me, but panic slammed a door in my mind. I stayed human. I stayed small. Fenrir let out a triumphant bark, stepping forward to claim the throne, but Rorik moved with the speed of a strike. He didn't shift, he dominated. If she cannot find the wolf on her own, I will bring it out, Rorik announced, his voice a tectonic rumble. I invoke the trial of claiming. I will mark her. If she survives the bond, the wolf is proven. The air turned electric as the ancient words of the soul bind were spoken. Torchlight flickered against the pre-dawn dark as Rorik turned to me, his eyes molten gold, his hands framing my face with a possessive, desperate heat. Maeve Holloway, he whispered, do you accept me as your mate? Will you stand beside me as my queen? My human heart faltered, but deep in my marrow, the silver crest fire finally erupted. Yes, I cried out, the word of vow and a surrender. I accept. His teeth pierced my throat, and I felt it, the bond. It wasn't just instinct or biology, I felt his soul touch mine. 2 centuries of loneliness, of searching, of hoping, crashed into me. And beneath it all, love. Fierce, possessive, eternal love. For me. The pain transformed into euphoria, and I heard his voice in my mind for the first time. Mine. Finally, you're mine. And my wolf answered what my human heart had been denying. Yours. Always. The transformation was instantaneous and violent. I didn't break, I expanded. In a flash of silver light, I stood on 4 legs, a massive wolf with fur like moonlit silk. The pack erupted into a deafening howl of recognition. Cheat. Witchcraft. Fenrir screamed, shifting into a scarred, gray beast and lunging at Rorik. The combat was savage. They tore at each other in a blur of fur and fangs, the sound of snapping bone echoing off the standing stones. Rorik was faster, but Fenrir fought with the desperation of a dying man, his claws shredding Rorik's flank. I couldn't watch him bleed. With a snarl that shook the earth, I joined the fray, my silver for a streak of lightning as I slammed into Fenrir's side. My interference was a sacrilege of tradition, but the raw power of my royal blood made Fenrir hesitate for a fatal second. Rorik seized the opening, his jaws locking onto Fenrir's throat until the rival alpha went limp. Rorik shifted back, bloodied and gasping, standing over the fallen traitor. He turned to the council, his gaze lethal. Any other challenges? Silence was his only answer. Hours later, in the quiet sanctuary of the estate, I tended to the deep gashes on Rorik's shoulder. I was so afraid of losing myself to you, I whispered. But I found the part of me that was always missing. Rorik pulled me into his arms, his forehead against mine. You were never missing, Maeve. You were just waiting to be found. 3 months later, I stood beside my king at the Great Summit. When a visiting alpha sneered at my human-born status, I didn't reach for a knife. I let my eyes bleed to gold, my voice carrying the weight of an empire. I am not just the alpha king's mate. I am a queen in my own right. Question me again, and you'll answer to both of us. The alpha bowed, and Rorik's pride radiated through the bond like a sun. I leaned into him, a smirk playing on my lips. Think I've finally gotten the hang of this whole queen thing. Rorik kissed my crown. My love, you were always a queen. You just needed to remember. But as the celebration peaked, a cold wind swept through the hall, extinguishing every candle. From the shadows of the throne, a mirror cracked and a face appeared in the shards, not a wolf, but a man with skin like parchment and eyes like voids. The silver crest has awakened, the reflection hissed, a sound only I could hear. The debt to the abyss is now due. I am coming for the heart that beats in your chest, Maeve, and Rorik will be the one to hand it to me.